two distinguished commentators talk about family and state in Britain and China. It's a very important topic, and I personally am delighted that Alan Macfarlane has agreed to give these two lectures here at the Resolution Foundation. Just checking. This is the moment when Alan says, "Oh, I've forgotten my lecture notes." And I say, "Don't worry, you can busk it." Brilliant. But no, you've got the lecture notes. Brilliant. Alan is, I brought here from my library my selection of books by Alan. And if I had to pick up one that happens to be the first one that I read, which had an enormous influence on my thinking, The Origins of English Individualism. But Alan, has taken anthropology to a new level by bringing out its historical and practical and policy implications. And we very much look forward to what Alan, who is Emeritus Professor at King's College in Cambridge, is going to say. And after Alan, we will then have commentators, Professor Pat Thane, who's at King's College in London, will be giving a quick comment on his talk, and she will be followed by Anastasia de Waal, who is the Deputy Director of Civitas. A bit worried, I thought I'd said something so offensive, Alan, that you decided to walk out before the proceedings went any further. Right. So I now, with no more ado, let me turn to you, Alan, and invite you to address us, after which we'll hear from Pat Thane. Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. It's very kind of you to invite me, and kind of you all to come. I was warned when I announced that I was going to talk for some minutes, that you'd all have had a glass of wine and be sitting in these incredibly comfortable chairs, and it was the end of a long day, and many of you worked in London. So I basically had 3.5 minutes attention span from you. Well, you can doze off, but I'm afraid I'm going to go on a little longer than that. The topic I wanted to talk about, which is basically about some of the problems we face with a rapidly changing world. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is so vast that I can only just touch on a tiny bit now. I've got basically 40 minutes, 20 minutes today and 20 minutes in my second talk. I am writing a short book. I've been invited to write short master's letters to young Chinese, so I write short books knowing that I know what the Chinese version says, and I've written quite a few of these, and I've just written, prompted by David's invitation, the last 2 weeks, a short book on how to survive, which is how to survive all sorts of things like multiculturalism and what I'm going to be talking about. I hope to bring some copies of that next time as a rough working thing for people to comment on. So if I gallop across things and you want a little more information, I hope some of you will be able to see it there. So, family and state in Britain and China. This one will be the Britain one, mainly. Next time, a bit more on China. The central question behind David's book, The Pinch, which I hope some of you know, which is a pun, of course, on stealing and being pinched, as in short of things, was anticipated some 18 years before he wrote his book in a very good set of essays called Justice Between Age Groups and Generations, edited by Peter Laslett and James Fishkin. And I'll just read you the beginning of it, just to show you that this has been a subject that's been going on for some time. David Thompson writes, "Second, this perpetual reshaping of the welfare states has not been random or patternless. Instead, certain generations are emerging as persistent winners as they find the prizes and penalties of membership reshaped in step with their own ageing interests. In the process, two distinct welfare states have been created within each national one. These are not the welfare states of the middle class and the poor. They are those of the welfare generation, the initiator generation of young adults for whom the post-war welfare states were created primarily, and of their successors. The first welfare state has been one of large lifetime benefits and few contributions. The second, the necessary antithesis. Membership is determined by date of birth, and passing from one state to the other is not permitted. In short, neither consistency nor reciprocity, the essentials of a sustainable welfare contract, have been apparent in practice. Now, this is the theme of David's book, which adds a lot of analysis to what was sketched out some years before. And his argument, if some of you don't know it, is simple to summarise. That is that the generation born in Britain between 1946 and 1966, that's the baby boomers, was very large, very powerful politically, and benefited from rapid rises in living standards, and particularly good pensions, combined with a longer life and rocketing house prices. So it has done very well, but at the expense of the smaller generation of its children, who are now facing great difficulties in finding houses, jobs, and likely to receive diminished pensions. In other words, a pinched future. Now, this argument is obviously very convincing, and it was given some added impetus, I think, by David's reading of recent historical demography, or fairly recent, particularly the work of Peter Laslett and the Cambridge Group, and my work on the origins of English individualism. Because what I attempted to show was that for some 600 years at least in this country, we have had an unusual family structure. Almost all societies, and I'll show you a diagram to drive it home, have an upward flow of wealth from children to parents. And this is why population rates are very high in many parts of the world. It was put forward, for example, by J.C. Caldwell in relation to Nigeria. So basically the children support their parents more than their parents support them. The English case was based on a separation between the family and the economy, which is, as Weber said, the basis of capitalism. So that parents would educate their children to the age of around 12, and then the children would go off as servants, apprentices, or to school. After they left home, they had no more responsibility for their parents, unless they felt they wanted to, and their parents had no more responsibility for them, unless they felt they wanted to. This is the great difference between this system and China, as we'll see later. This basically means that parents bore the cost of their children in infancy and early childhood, but not after that. So it can be illustrated as follows. It's easier to see these side ones than this rather small one here. But on the left you have the joint family system, which is the system for 95% of human societies, where you have the parents, these are the anthropological symbols for a male and a female. The parents are supported, the upward arrows, by their children. Wealth and support, looking after them when they're sick and old and needing help, and working for them on a family farm. On the right is the individualistic family system, which goes back really to Anglo-Saxon England. And there you, as you see, the parents have the duty and responsibility for early education, the downward flow on the left. But after they've educated their children, their wealth, if they make it after those first few years, goes into a kind of pot, which I've roughly labelled the state, society and economy. So you go on working, your children have left home, you may have taken in apprentices yourself, and as you see, your children do the same thing. they don't return the wealth to you. And if you live into old age or are sick, then you draw on what you have invested in the state, society and economy. So children are not an investment economically, and maybe even not socially. So basically parents have the cost of their children, but then their children have the cost of their children. This was the system that was in place around the time of the founding of the welfare state in this country. And I want to now, this is the basic argument of the origins of English individualism, I want to now move on to extending it and adding some features. David's book is extremely good on describing what has happened, and it prompted me to think about what else one could say. And I think what else one could say is perhaps introduced best by one of Einstein's brilliant observations, which applies to almost everything in our lives. And that is, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. Whatever it is, from war to ecological problems, you have to rise up one level above the problems if you're going to solve them. In this case, then, if we apply this to David's work, I think we need to extend the analysis in three directions. One is to think laterally. Almost all of David's book is about England, though there are references to China and elsewhere. But as an anthropologist, I always believe that you can't solve a problem from within a culture, and that's why I'll be talking about China in the next session. And I'm also implicitly always comparing Britain with other places I've been, Nepal, Japan, and so on. We live in a global world, and this is something which is particularly important now for obvious reasons. And I'll just show you a diagram which I was amazed to see the first time, and some of you may not have seen it. This is a shift in the world's economic centre of gravity. And as you can maybe see, down on the right-hand side, in AD 1, the world's centre of gravity was somewhere in the Stans, in Central Asia. Gradually, by 1820, it had moved up. By its height, by 1950, it was just off America. It had moved north and west. What has happened since then, as you see, is that it is rapidly working backwards. I'm delighted that Martin Jakes is here, and he's written a very good book on When China Rules the World. And as you can see, there's some evidence that it will do from the huge jump in 2010, 2025, even though some doomsayers say that China is slowing down, which it obviously is and has to. It's still growing faster now than it's ever grown because of its size. So basically, China is enormously important, and important to understand how it's dealing with the problems I'll address in a minute. So, the second way in which we need to rise up above the problem is to see how things change. Even in my age, fairly long, but in historical terms, short lifetime, there's been an amazing change, even in the last 20 years. And the problem that David's interested in, the baby boom family in the middle, is obviously enormously impacted by the various features, which I can only talk about one or two here. I'll be talking about the one on the left, work, in the last part of this lecture. But equally important, and I'll be also mentioning the age structure, but equally important are changes in education and leisure and democracy and power, and many other things. In other words, the baby boom problem is contextual within many other pressures. And so I now want to look at some of these structural pressures and features. This is a slightly more elaborate version of that idea of upward and downward flow. There's an upper generation of parents and grandparents who, in the last generation or two, they have paid into pensions, and the value of those pensions, as you see on the left, has gone up and up. As regards the lower generation, the pensions are going down and down. The same is with healthcare. The value for my generation is going up or remaining very high. The value for the younger generation is going down. Work, which I'll talk about a little more, the returns on the labour we did in our earlier lives is very high, and as we know with our grandchildren and children, the returns are not going up nearly as fast. And obviously very dramatically, this is the case with housing, which David deals with, and I know the Resolution Foundation have looked at, that basically in some parts of this country, people are spending 50% of their income on housing. So basically the costs have gone up in all those four spheres for the lower generation, and the value has gone up for my generation, although I'm not quite in the baby boom. Putting this in another way, and just in a simplified dramatic form, in relation to the age structure. Previous to World War II, if you use the divisions into the 4 ages were used by Peter Laslett. The first age is the educational age, the second age is the working age, the third and fourth age up to the Second World War were really just one small lump of retired. And you can see a typical age structure for a developing country down at the bottom, very peaked, a lot of young children, middling, and then very few higher up. After the Second World War, we've moved, and it began before of course, but it's become more dramatic. We've moved to the right hand, where the pyramid, as you see, has almost equal numbers of first, second and third ages. Third ages are those who've retired but are independent, which now means between the age of, say, 60 or 65 and 85 or 90. Many people I know are in their 80s and are still very independent and doing lots of things. And you can see the effect above. The retired third ages are perhaps as big a group now as any of the other ones. And these are the people who are sucking in the pensions and living in the more expensive houses and so on. So that's the gist of the problem. And the last contextual matter, which is often overlooked, is, and that shows the same thing in a more dramatic form, as seesaws. The old ride high, the young ride low. And the dramatic background to this is world population. This is already a bit out of date, and the red UN high figure is the one that we're still pursuing. When I was a child, there were 2.5 billion, roughly 2.5 billion people on this planet. There are now 7.5 billion, roughly. And there is no, population is growing faster now than ever in history, because it's a much bigger population, even if the rates are down a bit. So it looks almost certain, I think, short of some catastrophe, that we'll have 10, 15, 20. If we went on like this for another couple of centuries, we'd have 500 billion. If we went on for another couple of centuries after that, the human population would be expanding out at the speed of light. from this planet. So population and the crowding and the feelings people have of crowding are obviously some of the background. I now want to turn for the last 6 or 7 minutes to work. I think this can be summarized very simply. If you think of the different shirts that people work when they go to work, there are basically 4. The farm labourers and people who work out in the sun wear a shirt without a collar because they sweat so much that they wouldn't be able to have a collar. That group, the farm labouring population in this country, as you all know, disappeared roughly between 1850 and 1950, driven out by new machines and later by tractors. So here, and increasingly in China, the countryside is empty except for machines and a few people. So the no collars disappeared. The blue collars, the ones who were inside working with machines in the Industrial Revolution, the blue collars disappeared very dramatically after the Second World War. The Thatcherite era is famous here, the Rust Belt is famous in America. It's still alive in Shanghai and the east coast of China, but it will disappear there too, because basically machines, fairly intelligent machines, can do much better and they don't cause trouble. And so the whole blue-collar workforce of the world is very likely within the next 20 years to have disappeared. It's already disappeared more or less here. The next collar up are white collar. They're the people who are not using their hands and machines, and therefore their collars stay pretty clean. And there are 2 groups of them. There's the secretarial, low administrative level of them, and then there are the professional middle and upper middle classes. They were more difficult to replace because they are doing jobs which it's quite difficult to get a machine to do unless it's quite intelligent. But given the exponential growth of the power of computers, it's, I'm sure, pretty certain that within the next 20 years, nearly all white-collar jobs will have gone in advanced economies. Of course, we'll fill up our time and shuffle paper around to a certain extent, but basically, one doctor, one teacher, one soldier will, with machines, be able to do what now 20, 30 people can do. The only people who will be left at that point will be the stripy collars. I'm wearing a stripy collar, if you can't see it, which basically means the top bankers, the top executives, the top of various organizations who then run large organizations below them, and they may, with their astronomical salaries, continue. And of course entertainers and the service industries and so on will continue. Now I want to end by mentioning 3 consequences of this. The first one is how we earn a living. Since there will not be work, Marx's prediction that capitalism will collapse will be borne out, not because of the reason he thought, which is the accumulation of capital, but by machinery. And therefore, we are going to have to totally rethink the whole way in which wealth is distributed, because the old model, which is that you did some work and you were paid for it. Of course, the recent Swiss referendum and experiments that are going on are already thinking about this problem, and I think you've had a resolution meeting about it. Basically, minimum wage for everyone and entitlements and so on and so on. So a whole new capitalist, post-capitalist model in a world where you don't reward people for what they do in terms of work needs to be developed. The second problem is what will people do with their time? Because most people, for most of history, have spent most of their time working very hard. And so if we move into what Thorstein Veblen called the leisure class, we live in a situation where, in theory, if the wealth is there, most people can live with the lifestyles of a Roman aristocrat, a Russian nobleman, or a country gentleman of the 18th century. In other words, they'll have a great deal of leisure. Now, the implication of that, of course, is how do you educate people to make good use of that leisure, and that poses a big problem for our educational systems. Sport, games, playing, homo ludens, as Huizinga called it, will obviously occupy a lot of it, as well as hopefully reading, music, all the crafts, arts and so on. There's plenty to do, and people are, when faced with the problem of leading a leisurely life, have managed in the past to do so. But it's just a strange experience to imagine a world with, say, 10 billion people with a lot of leisure. And the last implication is on family life. The conventional life cycle of the Anglosphere, the English system, is your children to leave home in their teens or at university level, and then disappear and make their own livings. Now, as we can see all around us, and it's widely reported, they're not doing that. They're having to stay at home because of the cost of housing and so on. This goes against the grain of the whole system I described in English individualism, which was that you can't have two governors in one house. This was a 17th century saying. Someone has got to be in charge, and if you have adult children with their children, or wives or whatever living, you're moving towards an extended household model which this country has never had. Likewise, in other countries where they have joint farming, etc., places like China, you're going to have a situation where the children can't operate jointly, they will have no work, and so you have to think of a new system for organising the family. I hope it doesn't sound too depressing. It may not happen. As you know, the great thing about predictions is that they're nearly always wrong, but it looks to me as if this is the sort of trend we're moving towards. It's not necessarily depressing, because many people's life and work is extremely horrible, and it would be great if that was alleviated a good deal. But it does pose new problems, and we have to think in entirely new ways. We've never faced any of these things before. They're happening very, very fast. So it's the sort of thing that I hope the Resolution Foundation will get its teeth into. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you very much, Alan, for that excellent talk. Now, can I invite Professor Pat Thane, author of Old Age in English Society, Professor at King's College London, for a quick response.
Right. Thank you for inviting me. I've done a lot of work on the history of relationships between older and younger generations in Britain. I've also visited China about 7 times over the last 20 years, and I rather hope I might talk more about China. Perhaps we will in the discussion. I've been lecturing in universities there about the history of old age and the family in Britain, among other things. And this has given me an opportunity to discuss comparisons between the UK and China in these respects. But since Alan talked mostly about Britain, I'll stick mainly with that. As he pointed out that we've had a historically unusual family structure in this country, and it's true we've no tradition of the generations living together as the parents grow older, as is true in some other cultures. And indeed very strong evidence that older people for centuries have preferred to keep as much independence as possible for as long as possible. But if generations don't live together, they don't necessarily fail to support one another. And if they do live together, they're not necessarily very supportive. There's strong historical evidence here of family members living nearby and adult children giving a lot of care to their elders, which I've written about in my book. And also older people in return helping younger people, for example, caring for grandchildren. Because into the 20th century, many older people, especially poorer ones, didn't have surviving children. Either they hadn't married, as quite a lot of people didn't, or because of the very high death rates from birth onwards, much higher, very much higher than now, they didn't have children to help them, or the children might be too poor to help. Some children, of course, did migrate away in search of work, as people have done for hundreds of years, and would lose contact. I think an important reason why the British state has long given at least basic support to destitute older people, apart from the fact they could afford to, is they often didn't have children to help them, or the children were too poor to help. But it seems to me the evidence is quite strong that if there were children around and they had any resources, they did quite a lot to support older people. And I suggest we should be cautious of assuming that families live together always provide cosy, supportive relationships. We know how much domestic abuse goes on within families in Britain and elsewhere, and I've heard that's also true in China from people who work on these things, but I don't know that. The one country for which there is evidence of neglect and abuse of elders in families is Japan, where it's long been normal for older people to move in to live with the eldest son and his family. And for this reason, state services supporting older people were very limited for a long time. A national survey in 1994 found that 1 in 2 family carers had subjected frail older people to abuse or extreme neglect, and 1 in 3 acknowledged antagonism to them. It's not necessarily because they were evil people, but in the absence of support services, they had neither the skills nor often the time to give the extensive care their elders needed, and acted badly out of exhaustion and frustration. Since then, Japanese support services have improved. My colleague Mayumi Hayashi, who works on family care in Japan and Britain, argues that British families are at least as supportive as Japanese families, though living arrangements are different, partly because they have supportive services to help them. And family care perhaps is most effective when it is supported in that way. On the issue of intergenerational relations, it's true, of course, that there are a number of quite wealthy older people in Britain, but we have to remember that there are many more on low incomes, that there's a big income and wealth gap within the older generation, just as there is among younger generations, and the wealth gap within generations may be as great as that between them. It's true that after the Second World War, the welfare state expanded, but the state pensions that were provided were not enough to live on. The British state pension on its own has never provided enough to live on. Almost immediately, about 1 million people had to apply for a means-tested supplement in order to survive at pensionable age. A minority of people did very well because occupational pensions expanded, so people in reasonably well-paid jobs had good occupational pensions, and many of them have gone on benefiting. They're more likely to be men than women, because men being more likely to be in such jobs, and the pensions are related to income. Men earn more than women in general. It's also important to remember that most older people in this country and in most other countries are female, because we live longer. But because of poorer work opportunities, older women are often poorer than older men. So I think I'm not very happy about generalising too much about generations. I think we have to look at inequalities within generations as well as inequalities between generations. I think it's also important that we shouldn't think of retired people as burdens on younger people, but take account of how much older people give their families and society. They always have and still do. Give some brief examples. There's evidence that as many as 1 in 3 working mothers depend on grandparents for childcare, They don't share a home, but the grandparents give a lot of support. And that may well be increasing as childcare has become more and more expensive in recent years. The family carers for people in their 80s and 90s are often their retired children in their 60s. Also, a very high portion of voluntary work, both formal and informal, is carried out by retired people, including voluntary service overseas in poorer countries, where increasing numbers of retired nurses, doctors, teachers, engineers are going in their late 50s, 60s to work with people who need their help. 31% of grandparents help their grandchildren buy a home. 16% in their 60s and 30% in their 70s give financial support to children and grandchildren. Transfers are artificially recorded, and I think we don't know enough about these kinds of intergenerational relationships. But I think the generations have supported each other over time more than we always realise, and continue to do so while still often living separately for as long as they can. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Pat. And then finally we have Anastasia de Waal, who is the Deputy Director at the think tank Civitas. Anastasia, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's always a privilege to do anything with the Resolution Foundation, because it's the kind of stuff that is produced here is exactly the kind of thing that isn't just exciting for people like me, but actually really feels like a contribution that makes a huge difference to basically the endeavour, especially around looking at the family. So to be part of that in a small way is, as I say, very exciting. Also very nice is to be doing something with Alan, because funnily enough, my mother, I should add, as a mature student, was supervised for her PhD by Alan, and so there isn't just a family connection there, but then I spent my childhood being, as it were, trawled around different parts of the world looking at different types of family, first in Greece, in rural Greece, and then in Albania, and very much seeing the fruits of Alan's support academically, but also seeing very different family forms and very different support mechanisms through the family. Particularly interesting actually was contrasting a very similar in many ways culturally Greece and Albania, but equally we went to Albania just after communism had fallen, so having a look at how communism had impacted on the family in some ways, but in many ways really hadn't made much of a difference if you were to look at particularly the rural areas and compare with Greece. So I just wanted, just for a couple of minutes, to pick up on some of the things that Alan was talking about, particularly around the individualism element of the UK family and also the economic element. And I suppose really, I mean, for me, I've looked at family-related issues, particularly marriage now, for a few years, and I often do think that when we're talking about family policy, actually I think it would be probably more accurate to be thinking about economic policy, because they're so inextricable. And I think that this connection actually with the economy in terms of an economy at large and economic structures and the particular type of very nuclear-focused family that we have in this country and historically has been absolutely the mainstay is very significant. And what I just wanted to think about now was some of the things today that are to the fore when it comes to this very individualised sense of family, the family unit, and also some of the changes that perhaps are happening economically which are then impacting on how the family unit behaves, and perhaps some of the re-emergence now, or new emergence perhaps, of the support of the extended family. So just thinking about some of the positives, perhaps if you could put it like that, about the this very individualised family. You've got much greater autonomy in terms of how you make this family, in terms of partnership. One of the things I'm looking at the moment is marriage, and it's very clear that marriage and the forerunner in terms of cohabitation is very much about self-fulfilment rather than about kinship fulfillment or extended ties or trying to please your parents when it comes to making that partnership. So there are a lot of positives in that sense, and also, of course, there are huge positives in the potential of being able to be supported either in your own raising of children or perhaps in your later years when it comes to elder care by a state rather than having to be reliant on family loyalty. Of course, that may be much better in the long run, but equally it may be potentially much more vulnerable and much less reliable. This idea perhaps of if you like, a sort of social conservatism around the family is very much something which isn't, I think, a part of the picture today. And a lot of that, actually, for all we talk about the non-traditional family form, is more to do, I think, with the idea that parents are not shackling or shackled to children in the way that perhaps Alan was describing earlier. Personal happiness, as I say, is absolutely fundamental to the family today, and that's very interesting because, of course, that's very much part and parcel of an ever-changing family, both in terms of separation and also in terms of new families, so blended families, perhaps post-separation, remarriage, or the reforming of new families, bringing in different partnerships and perhaps bringing two sets of children together. I think, of course, the reality is that there are also negatives, if we can put it as bluntly as that. I mean, one of the things that we're hearing, thankfully increasingly as a social problem, is the idea of isolation and loneliness. And this is particularly acute, it seems, around the older years, but also is something that we know is experienced throughout life. I mean, we're talking not just about single parents who might find themselves in this situation, but there has been a huge increase in the number of people living alone throughout life. The other essence is perhaps a sense of responsibility as well. Is that something that we feel is eroded, or perhaps less than eroded, is less strong than in other countries in terms of familial ties? Is this something which impoverishes a society, or is it actually that double-edged sword, something which can contribute because it means other forms of solidarity that are not about kinship ties, but equally it could somehow be undermining in a community? And then I think, just to end really, I wanted to talk about some of the new emerging ideas around how we perhaps see some blurring of this nuclear extended family today. And a lot of that, to come back to this idea of economics affecting family structure, is to do with general economic change. It can be perhaps to do with more specific things like cuts to particular services, or just a general economic shift in terms of the sorts of things, again, Alan was talking about with employment. So one example is what Alan referred to, that the housing issue, which can mean that just simply accessing housing can mean quite different patterns of leaving the home, coming back to the home, but also partnership formation perhaps happening much sooner because people need to live together, or perhaps even need to buy together before they feel that the relationship is one that might be for the long haul. Equally, childcare, this is something which I think Pat and Alan talked about, is being definitely impacted by the I guess in some respects, straightforwardly cuts, but also, again, this is partly to do with the need to go and have perhaps two jobs in a family rather than one job. And this again means the extended family becoming involved in childcare, perhaps in a way that they weren't. And I think, finally, the sandwich generation is something which is increasingly talked about, and this is around the pressures of the very positive aspect of longevity on the one hand, partnership status and having children later, very positive in many cases, again, because that means having the opportunities to benefit from education and career development first before having children, but then can lead to the fraught decisions and the fraught realities around both caring in terms of elder care and in terms of childcare. So in other words, practicalities that really have quite a big impact on the way that we live our family lives, the way that households not just exist but actually form today, and the realities around the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Well, an interesting talk from Alan. Two challenges. Perhaps I'm going to turn to the audience in a moment to think of put your questions, but perhaps I can begin by inviting you, Alan, to comment on Pat's argument, which is that you may have different generations not physically living together, but nevertheless there could be significant exchanges of care between generations. So is the English family structure, is the relationship between parents and their children as the children enter teenagers and beyond as limited as you argue? I think we've got an interesting disagreement here and I'd like to explore it a bit further. Do you want to comment on that?
Thank you. It's obviously on a continuum, and it's a matter of what you compare it with. Ever since the work of Wilmot and Young and Bethnal Green and so on, we've known that in the East End and other parts of England, the lonely individualist who never sees their family and who doesn't get help with childcare and so on, is largely a myth. It's really a question of how deep and rich and continuous this kind of help is. I've lived for long periods in the hills in the Himalayas in a Nepalese village, and I've also seen Chinese and other family systems and read about them. Of course, here you may be looking after your grandchildren if their parents are out or they need help and so on. In a lot of these societies, though, it's not just a matter of living nearby and giving some help. You are, it's difficult to express it, you are one unit. You really are not separated at all. In other words, brothers and sisters, parents and even cousins feel themselves to be emotionally and economically and socially united. So if a brother, and here's a test case for England, if it's very visible with siblings, ask yourself, if you're English, if your brother or sister, if you've got one, said, my children want to go to Eton or a public school or private education, would you mind sharing some of your wealth, because you as brother are slightly older than us, and giving it to me? How many of you would actually do that? How many of you would pay for hospitals, expensive hospital operations for your aunts and uncles or your cousins? I mean, there is a strong lineal thing, and this is getting stronger as we all know, so that parents and grandparents are now doing more and more for their children. Once you move sideways and slightly away, then it's not nearly as strong. It's symbolically strong. You send postcards, you come together, and you may give gifts and so on. But when it comes to the crunch, I mean, I remember coming across this with one of my first PhD students who was Irish, and she came to Cambridge, and I asked her about her family, Southern Irish family, and she said, well, I'm a bit tight, Alan, because I have to educate all my younger brothers and sisters through college and university. That is my obligation. This is the obligation in many joint family systems. I don't think we've got to that stage, and I think we're still in a kind of moving, perhaps a little in that direction. So I tend to be accused by my accusers of overdoing the English individualism, because I'm 5'8" Scottish, so I feel, but I do feel that it's very extreme at one end of the continuum, and maybe shifting a bit, but that if you just blend it in and say, well, we support our families and we like to have them nearby, I think you begin to make it difficult to compare or to see what is special about our system.
Right. Well, I think I should just give Pat a second opportunity. And I'm sitting between two proper academics, but I have a dim recollection of a piece of work by a guy called Smith, if I remember correctly. He had the smart idea that he would track old people in receipt of poor law support in a village and link that to the location of their children and what we knew about the affluence of their children from the assets that they owned. And I thought his work showed that in England you could have an affluent adult child living in the same town or village as an elderly parent in receipt of poor law support, which is the kind of argument you hear from Alan.
What I remember of research like that on the poor law was that affluent children like that would be prosecuted by the magistrates. And there were a lot of cases where there were suspicions, but then it turned out the children couldn't afford to support them. And there was a big effort in the late 19th century to cut back on outdoor relief and force families to support their relatives. And they had to give up because there really weren't that many who could afford it. There were very many poor families who, could help out. Yeah. They could provide some meals, but they couldn't provide permanent support. So, I mean, I've been mainly concerned with parent-child relationships rather than the broader family links, which have always been weaker here. But you can have really very strong relationships between relatives who live a street or a few streets apart, which has been the traditional, living different parts of the same village or the same town. I mean, Will Modern Young's work is one example of that in the 1950s, but there is evidence further back. And of course, I suggested you can have quite serious tensions when you're all living together.
Yeah.
One shouldn't romanticize that. And I think that is a slight danger, a big danger.
Anastasia, you want to observe on that before you...
Just on one point, which is the geography today of not really living in down the street from each other, or perhaps even in the same city. And I think that can be underestimated, perhaps. I mean, not just the whole idea of people commuting and not actually really living anywhere for a lot of the week, but also the idea that then the community isn't really embedded, the new community, but the reality of how much scope is there to see your relatives, your closest non-nuclear relatives, when you really don't live anywhere near, let alone the idea of far-flung cousins. I mean, I think that's a very practical, but a very real thing.
But it's a lot easier to keep in contact now. I mean, it was also true in the past that relatives moved far away. And in the 19th century, hundreds of thousands went to Australia, and they'd never see their relatives again. I mean, now you can be back from Australia in 24 hours. You can talk on Skype. Modern technology and communications do enable people to get together in quite unprecedented ways, and I think that needs to be thought about. And there is interesting research on that.
Now, are there people here who wish to make observations or put questions about what you've heard? Yes, and we've got a roving mic, so, and if you could give your name and organisation, if that's right, that would be good.
David Steele from Age UK. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about what the policy consequences are of this interpretation, and one could say, well, if we have this very individualistic view of the family and individualistic practice, then that does, in a sense, transfer a lot of responsibility to society as a whole. And you could argue from that, for example, that the state pension should be substantially raised from its present level in order to lift out of poverty the 1.6 million older people who still are in poverty. I should have said, by the way, my name is David Steele from Age UK, so this is a field that I work in. But there is a huge amount of inequality in the older generation, and there is still this very large number of people living in poverty. So, if we're taking this individualistic view, shouldn't we be more generous through our state mechanisms?
Right. Alan, do you want to stray into the treacherous waters of current social security policy?
Yes.
Good.
I'm sure you're right. I mean, basically, there's no point in these gatherings unless we think completely crazy ideas, as Einstein suggested. Basically, unless an idea starts as absurd, there's no hope for it, as Einstein said. Of course, I mean, there should be, if you use the Amartya Sen's idea of entitlements, which I referred to, we are moving from a society in which you get your rewards from what you put into the society through your skills and through your hard work, to a society where the fact that you were born in that society entitles you, as he worked on famines, entitles you to a minimum decent life. We are rich enough to do that. Means a bit of redistribution, but not very much. And therefore, all old people should have an absolute basic entitlement which leads them to have a reasonable standard of living. If we carved our cake in a fairer way, there is absolutely no reason why that shouldn't be the case. The idea, of course, when it's applied to the working age, that everyone would sit back and do nothing, which is the chief argument against an entitlement, basic entitlement of the Swiss kind, is also, I think, a very Protestant kind of idea. A lot of people like doing things, and if you work out the incentive structure and decide which jobs need people, and then add on a bit on top of the basic entitlement, lots of people would do that, as we know with retired people and who take on voluntary jobs and so on and so on. So I don't think there's an argument against basic entitlements at each stage in your life, and certainly applying to old age as much as any of the others.
No, I agree that
Right.
there's a real problem of poverty.
Anastasia?
Yeah, I mean, just one thing to say, I mean, when we hear that in other countries they're perhaps shocked, I mean, to go back to Greece as an example, that we put older people in homes, I mean, I think that the flip side to that is that, I guess what I was trying to sort of talk a little bit about earlier is that if we have a minimum level of care, and of course that requires good investment rather than lower investment, then society looking after the older population, rather than it being down to the basically potluck of your family, could potentially be a very positive thing rather than just a negative. But of course it requires, and that's what we see here, much better investment. So I think to have a sort of almost falling between two stools reality, as we do today, is probably the worst scenario in many ways.
Right, thank you very much. I'm going to take now, there's a lady over there. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm Emily Holtzhausen from Carers UK, and I'm definitely using that example from the 1850s that you gave about families being required to pay for each other. But I was fascinated by what you said, because thinking about the world and how different communities care for their relatives, quite often people look abroad to say, oh, they've sorted it, and quite often they haven't. And I'm fascinated by the challenges that China has, its population structure, needs to work, familial duties, and although we have, as you say, a very different individual structure, actually those things are all the same here. So, and what you've all told us as well is that it is a fluid thing that is changed by other external factors, but some cause remain. So what I'm fascinated now with our ageing population in both of our countries is how do you think this will go in the future, the push and the pull of work versus the need to care for a relative, quite often whom people love and have this tie to, as well as a strong sense of duty. I know in China that there's actually a legal requirement to visit your relatives, which we don't have here, but I'm quite interested. I might have got that wrong, you can correct me, but I'm very interested in that, about how we share that across the globe.
Thank you. Next. Alan, do you want to comment on that?
I moved this way because my hearing aid in this ear collapsed just before this talk, and I'm not very hearing full in this ear either, so which means, of course, I can interpret your questions to be anything I like, but...
do you want to stand by the microphone so if anybody else here has a similar affliction, is able to hear? Very good.
Yes. In China, I mean, one of the things I was going to mention for the next time, in China, in Shanghai, they've just introduced a new regulation in the Shanghai government that all children who have parents in need must support them, and if they don't, they will be taxed and their social credit will be reduced and so on. This is partly because, of course, many children live in one place and the parents live in another place. But it may work in China because it's built on a deep Confucian obligation in the past that you did support your parents. The problem with China, of course, is if you think of it as rather like a large wine glass, a large aging older population, and the one-child policy, which has reduced the stem to quite narrow. So each child is having to think about supporting 3 or 4 of his parents. I think in this country, we've really got to have a complete kind of shift in our whole mentality and morality now, with a world where everything is changing so fast. And I'll be talking about this in relation to health next time. It seems to me that one model is to do again what I'll be talking about in relation to China, which is decentralizing, moving downwards, something Anastasia talked about, which is what they're doing in China, which is localizing everything. There is, what we've inherited is, in this country, is a 19th century institutional complex, what Goffman called asylums, places where you put old people, places where you send people to hospitals, places where you send people to prisons, places where you educate people. And that all made sense where there were scarcities. You only had one guard or one teacher or one nurse. Now we can distribute many of these things because of our wealth and also because of modern communications technologies. And there is no reason why we shouldn't move more towards what I've seen in parts of China, which is that you go to a village and they have all the local facilities there. They have a good school, a good health clinic, a police post, and so on. It's down to the village level. In some ways, you could say we're just returning to the 17th century, where you had most things at a local level. And through the 19th century, we moved away to it, towards large buildings into which we cram lots of people, which are very expensive and can't go on. And that we're moving back to a more distributed local level. Just as, and I won't have time to talk about that, in relation to democracy, that civil society and democracy has to be localized and moved down, because the old model of parliamentary centralized systems is not appealing to people anymore. So that certainly applies to all of this. I don't think that necessarily, given the theme of individualism is that our children are taught from very early on, from infancy, to become independent, self-governing people who become adult. It's all in John Locke's treatise on education. They become adult very young, as Tocqueville noticed of the Americans. And the strain in our system is that if you have been taught from very early on to be an independent adult, in control of your own income, and so on, and then you've grown up through life like that, it's very difficult then to merge back parents into a situation like that. And you get a lot of bullying and so on and so on. I've seen it with my own family. It's just very difficult for 2 generations to live together. On the other hand, it's not at all difficult to begin to think of new ways in which we can merge together, as we already are.
Thank you. Pat?
Well, I think after the Second World War, we did develop quite good local services in many places, giving people community support, both voluntary and statutory. And Meals on Wheels, for example, were operated by the Women's Voluntary Service. And there was more and more social work district nurses. That's been badly eroded by cuts in the last few years, both the voluntary sector and the statutory sector. And that grew up partly as a reaction against dumping old people in workhouses and the very bad conditions that were discovered in immediate post-war institutions. And now, I mean, quite a lot of older people go into care homes, but very often it is because they're too frail to be cared for by their families. It's very hard to look after somebody with dementia, and families don't have the skills. And that's the point at which many people do go into a care home, often extremely reluctantly on the part of their families. They're very exercise. And I've known many families where that's happened.
Thank you. Anastasia?
I think just to pick up on this idea of a duty to care, and this idea that, Alan, you were mentioning, the Shanghai obligation that you will face penalties if you don't. I mean, in some ways what's interesting here is the contrast between what we have essentially, which is a redistribution of caring. So society has redistributed care so that it's something that is, well, in theory, right across the board, but actually is about institutions and paid people caring for, let's say in the case of elder care. What we're seeing less than in China is that redistribution. And what does redistribution mean? Does it mean, again, going back to this idea of guarantees, or does it actually just straightforwardly mean depersonalisation? And what impact does that have? And really, is it about trying to find a combination of the two so that you can try and re-imbue, if you like, this sense of the familial, of there being the opportunities to be able to structurally allow that personalisation of care, whilst at the same time having that redistribution model, which probably is vital for a society where people are going to be in paid employment and therefore just straightforwardly not able practically to do that care.
Yeah. Right, now other questions. I think, I think what I might do is, I now see there are several questions. I'm going to collect several interventions. First of all, the gentleman here, I think you wanted to intervene.
The question is to Professor Macfarlane. First of all, I accept your description of the trends, the prognosis of where we're going, and unfortunately I can't share your optimism about the possible outcome, because the logic of the economy is such that we won't be allowed to resolve the problem in the way one ideally might want. But I'm not going to press you on that. The question is, do you have an overarching theory that explains the trends of, say, the last 500 years, the movement towards the individualistic family structure, which might then inform not only how things are going to pan out over the next few generations, but what we might do about them? Is there an organising mechanism that preordained the trends that you're talking about?
That's the kind of question we like at Resolution. I'm going to now...
I should have said I'm Fred Harrison of the Land Research Trust.
Thank you. Now the lady there.
Thank you for the talk. I'm Jiabao from King's College London. And my question for the panel is, how does the wealth gap within the older generation and between the and in the intergeneration affect the social certification in the younger generation? So I found that one assumption of the debate is that the unique individualism is the foundation of what the welfare state. So that sounds like the second generation of the rich is something that can only be found in China. But I found that it's not true, because I found that if you think about that, the social capital and also the cultural capital aside of the financial capital, then you found that the social capital and the cultural capital could be inherited from the older generation to the younger generation, and those two social capitals could be transformed into financial capital. So, so in some sense, I doubt that if the wealth gap in the older generation could be inherited to the younger generation.
Right, and I think there was a third question. Yes, you were the gentleman towards the back there, and I'll take those questions, and then we'll move over to the other side of the room. Yes,
I'll keep it brief. So I'm Carl Harris. I'm a clinical psychologist working in the National Health Service. I've worked with a lot of families who have been very isolated, typically women living in council estates in quite challenging circumstances. So I guess the question I've got is, how does all this look when you put it through the prisms of gender and class?
Right. Okay. Now we've got a series of ambitious questions. We've got a question about what your theory is to account for the patterns of the past 500 years. Where actually I think Alan is closer to having a theory to explain that than most people. I think we've got secondly this thought that inheritance even if you don't directly see financial inheritance, the inheritance of social and cultural capital can in turn enable financial wealth to be inherited, even if it doesn't show up as a direct financial transfer, because it enables you to secure more earnings yourself, and I think that's a very interesting observation. And then we thirdly had other gaps such as gender and class. Alan, do you want to comment?
Shall I take the first one?
Yeah.
Others, if you can take on the others. Not only am I deaf, but my memory is...
Do you want to stand by the microphone?
Well, yeah, I'll do that because I have a soft voice as well. All I've written down for your question is 500 years. And what
is there an overarching theory
We want a Gazette concept.
that explains the trends in the family structure, which is the fragmentation towards the extreme individualism?
Yeah.
How do we explain it?
Right.
Well, my theory is that over the last 1,000 years, not just 500, from Anglo-Saxon England, which Michael Wood knows a lot more about than I do, from Anglo-Saxon England, the legal and economic and political system of this country individualized people, and Christianity as well. All the different pressures put together from, and Michael would probably agree with me, from the Germanic conquests onwards, led to a highly individualized concept, both of the individual as a Christian and also as an economic actor. The family has never been strong, and the law has been, on the other hand, very strong in the political system. And this individualized system goes back, in my original book I thought took it back to the 12th century and later to the 8th, 9th century. It's very old, it's very peculiar, and it was quite widespread in Europe up to the 12th century, but then after that Roman law and so on subdued it. But it remained in this country. What is curious and interesting about the present situation is that in some ways, for the first time, it looks as if it is being eroded. In other words, all the work showed that we had a nuclear residence system for over the centuries. People didn't live with their parents. They moved away, they went to another town, they moved 4 or 5 times in their lives. And now, for the first time, as far as I know, quite a lot of people are not moving away from their homes. They're staying on into their 20s and 30s. In the past, your grandparents wouldn't have been alive to have helped you, the grandchildren, through education and so on. We now have much more of that kind of activity going on, intergenerational support. Something like 50% of homes now are bought jointly by children and parents. This kind of thing, as far as I know, would have been only the preserve of the very rich in the society in the 17th or 18th centuries. So we are moving towards, curiously, we were all told we were more moving towards individualism. We're actually moving towards familization in this country in some ways. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. Yeah. Pat?
Well, all these adults staying living with their parents seems to me it's a reversion to the situation in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s and 60s, where it was quite common in working class families for adults to stay there sometimes after they married, had their first child, and then might eventually maybe get a council house or find somewhere to move. It really was quite widespread. Then there was more housing and people were better off and they were able to move, and we're returning to that older situation, which I think is interesting, but I think it's worth being aware of. On the question of the inheritance, I mean, the children of rich people do inherit quite a lot of wealth, and quite often, there are a lot of lifetime transfers going on, sometimes quite complicated ones, where someone who's living on a house that's become vastly inflated in value can transfer part of the value of the house to a child by borrowing. So there are lots of the children of the rich carry on being reasonably rich. The problem is with the children of the poor. On the question of gender, class and people being lonely, there's some interesting work by Sarah Arbour at Surrey suggesting that this loneliness is particularly serious among older men if they're divorced or widowed, that they're less likely to have kept up close family or friendship ties, and so are more likely to be isolated than women who are more likely to keep up with family, friends. And that's the only evidence I know of that.
Thank you. Anastasia?
Just to pick up on the social capital question, I think, well, as Pat was saying, obviously wealth plays a huge role, but the reality is, and I think that the more commissions we have here about social mobility, the clearer that is, that social cultural capital is something you can be penniless. It still seems to have an enormous impact, and if anything, it has a stronghold that seems to be pretty much unbreakable, which is interesting when we consider at the same time that from you know, on the one hand we seem to have detached very early from our parents here compared to some other countries and cultures, but actually the attachment in terms of capital socially, culturally seems to be really very strong. And on the idea of the different experiences through the prism of class or gender, for example, I think that's one of the things that is so vital in terms of policy making to recognise, because I think too often trends are interpreted as being homogenous and experienced in the same way, or worse still, in many respects very positive trends are interpreted as being positive across the board, or vice versa. And I think that that's an extremely, very understandable, but nevertheless actually very clumsy way to go about interpreting the realities of what people are living. And just to go back to marriage, marriage is a classic example. I mean, we're seeing a very strong now marriage gap in terms of wealth, which is interpreted to be being about liberalised values and just different social norms, but actually seems to correlate very, very strongly with this idea of marriage not being accessible, the stability of partnerships not being accessible to those who've got less economic stability. So a really important thing to notice as actually different in an experience rather than homogeneous.
Thank you very much. Now I think finally I will take these three questions here, and then there'll be an opportunity for our panellists. Let's start with the gentleman at the back, then the two gentlemen. Yes.
Hello, my name is Alan Macfarlane. I'm an advisor on public services and growth. I was recently commissioned by the Government Ministry Biz to write an essay about for a forecasting project, a foresight project, looking at cities in the year 2065 in the UK and what they need to do to be internationally competitive. And I made a parallel and I made a comparison between British citizens, the welfare state and family structure, and cities in Vietnam, and the lack of basic or essential services and support services, family structure, economic activity, and productivity and promotion of growth.
We're a bit tight for time.
Yeah. So my question really is what are the panel's thoughts on the comparative advantages of either international economies linked to the position of the family and the provision of state services?
Right, and then if you want to pop the microphone straight forward, yep.
Good evening, Lord Willets and the rest of the panel. Thank you for hosting us. My question to Lord Willets first and then to the rest of the panel is a very short one. I want to ask you, recently there was a report on City AM about, you might have seen it, the bank of mum and dad, and I think this was a, economy worth, if it's in real terms, something like £5 billion. So basically, a lot of young children either in London or outside London buy their first house or flat, and their parents contribute quite a lot in percentage-wise through the deposit. I want to ask Lord Willett and the rest of the panel, how can the government address such a situation? For example, for a young person like myself, working and entrepreneur in London, and also others, how can the government address this issue, or how can young people themselves address this issue in a complex and challenging and globalized 21st century? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to pass the microphone along? Yes, gentleman back.
Thanks very much for the talk. My name is Vincent Thane. Sorry. Very much enjoyed Professor Macfarlane's optimistic prediction that our biggest problem in 50 years' time will be how to spend our spare time and how to redistribute our vast amounts of wealth, I think it's probably a bit closer to what Keynes predicted about his grandchildren and their fortunes. But I think under a more central scenario where technology isn't going to swoop in and save us all, the problem we're probably going to face in 50 years' time is how do we cope with the kind of seismic changes of moving from 3.5 working adults per old age dependent to 2.5 working adults to old age dependents. I mean, the cost on society, on the economy, on the public purse are going to be both seismic and kind of glacial in nature. And the last year of life is more costly on the health service than the preceding decades all accumulated together. Someone with dementia can take many physically capable and emotionally resilient people to look after for many, many years. Pensions are paid out for an increasingly large amount of time, despite the fact that contributions are fixed over quite a limited period. So in a country where many of these services are delivered or provided by the public sector, the impact is clearly felt on the public sector through the public sector balance sheet. I'll wrap up. You know, the implications for the public sector solvency are pretty stark. So just in response to a couple of other questions, I wanted to put this question out there, or this point out there, to say that we should put more money, ever increasing amounts of money into pensions, into long-term care, into health services is just not a viable solution.
Okay.
You know, the fundamental question is how do we support a larger older population with fewer working people?
We understand. Alan, your opportunity to make your some brief final remarks.
Thank you. Well, my short-term and long-term memory is nearly gone, so I've only remembered the last question, really. The Bank of Mum and Dad I wrote down. This is clearly something which preserves inequalities. You know, those of my generation know that we're torn because we can help our children and grandchildren a lot. I didn't send them to private schools, but now when they need help with housing and with their own children and so on, it's very difficult. We enjoy helping them in various ways, but obviously this is something we can do which many people can't do. So perhaps it comes back again to this idea that we've got to move to a system that at least basically everyone has enough. You can have some super rich, but if most people have reasonable health care and reasonable education and so on, because you share things more equally in a wealthy society, then you can have some banks of mum and dad.
Can I intervene? Is what you describe as the admirable behaviour as you, as a grandparent, consistent with the picture of the English family that you paint in your own books?
No, I mean, what has happened?
Anthropologists are different.
I mean, if you'd asked me to predict, say 20 years ago, what grandparents would be doing for their children, I'd have said, well, they'd have gone on doing what they always did, which was nothing. But it appears that the system is so flexible, and also the wealth is rising fast enough, and the family is important enough against my feelings that parents and grandparents were basically market individuals who were realizing that they should invest all their wealth in savings things and so on. Many parents and grandparents are behaving in a fairly altruistic manner now, much more than I might have predicted. So it's against what I would have really expected. But then if you think of the greatest theorist on all this, Adam Smith, what Adam Smith, if you remember, the central dynamic of his theory is that humans are driven by two powerful emotions. One is competition, profit-making, and so on, self-love. And the other is social love, that human beings like to be liked. And I like it when I see my grandchildren looking pleased when I can put something into their bank account. Giving away when you're affluent enough is one of the great pleasures for most people, as we know. It's true of many philanthropists and so on. So in terms of the last question, support and pensions and long-term care, I think the only thing I'll be talking about this next time. the one thing we know is that putting more and more money into a system that is having greater and greater strains on it, health, dementia, old age, all these things, will not work. It's as I use the metaphor, it's a bucket with a hole in the bottom. All this talk of throwing more money at the National Health Service is just a waste of space. You've got to redesign the system, and that's why China is important, because it's never had enough money to throw at problems like healthcare and so on. It's had to actually think about how you deal with them. So basically, we've got to shift from an idea that we throw lots of money at social problems to really thinking more deeply about how we can reorganize our social relationships, how we live, who we live with, what we do with people, in order to make life better for each of us.
Very good, thank you. Comments, Pat?
I suppose on the bank of mum and dad point, what drives that above all is the crazy price of housing and the failure of successive governments to do very much about that, to increase supply. There's also the problem of the concentration of population in London. And it's by no means an easy problem to solve, but that's the really major one. And housing, as we know, is just become incredibly expensive over the last 30 years. On the issue of there being more older than too few young people to support the older people, the balance has been shifting somewhat, of course, because more people do stay fit to later ages, and many more people are staying in the workforce past the normal retirement age, and they're going to have to. And there are huge socioeconomic disparities, and it's the better off to live longer and fitter longer. But it is a trend. Also, our birth rate's been going up since 2001. It's not quite a replacement rate. But I don't think people have always quite realised that. It's not true of many other European countries. Or, well, it's certainly not true in Japan and many other countries. But the birth rate has been going up. It is close to replacement. The other thing, of course, is we have a lot of immigrants who are younger, which is a highly sensitive issue at the moment. But no, that has changed the balance of the population, and it's something that needs to be taken into consideration.
Thank you very much. Anastasia?
Well, just to be very quick, looking at the time, I suppose really the thing that's particularly interesting about China, and to bring this all into a sort of elite punctuation, is that it is so explicitly responsive to social and economic change in a way that we don't see here in policy terms. I mean, every decision is very much about tomorrow's economy, about today's society, and how the two interact. And there is something fundamentally, I suppose, insightful about that, because it is actually many of the issues that we perhaps should be thinking about, or perhaps are thinking about, but either in a rather back burner way or not quite as explicitly, because politically it doesn't have the same cachet, or rather is slightly toxic. But that's the reality, that we are, whether it's longevity or whether it's about changing working patterns, this dialectical idea between social and economic change means that we have to constantly be responsive to that. And that means both being socially responsive to that, but also economically. And of course, where does policy come in? It comes in on both.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. We've run out of time really, so I'm sorry I can't answer the question that you put to me, Saved by the Bell. But I'm very grateful to Alan Macfarlane. I'm very grateful for our two other panellists. It's very good of Pat Thane and Anastasia to join us. And I should mention a fourth person who I should have thanked at the beginning, which is Professor Hugo de Berg, because Hugo at Westminster University at the China Media Centre has been the driving force behind this programme today and the second lecture, and we're very grateful at Resolution to have been able to do it with Hugo and with the China Media Centre. And I'm grateful to you all for coming along, and I hope you found our discussions illuminating. Thank you very much.